Hello and welcome back. This next lesson is possibly one of the most important in this whole series, as I'm going to be giving you an introduction to the Major Arcana, the 22 cards of the tarot deck that I would say are possibly the most important, and I would certainly say are the cards that give the tarot its unique identity. So, as you can see, I've got my table laid out with a variety of decks. I'll talk you through these decks briefly in a minute. These are the decks that I'm going to be referring to and comparing with during the course. And here in front of me, I have the Major Arcana of one of my tarot decks laid out in 3 piles. So that will become apparent in a minute too. Let me show you the decks that we're going to be using first. Having gone through the Minor Arcana, you'll see that I've constantly referred to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which we're going to continue to do so here. You've also seen me referring to the Golden Dawn tradition, and once again, that Golden Dawn tarot is part of the selection that I'm using here. But the symbolism of the Major Arcana I think goes that bit deeper than the other cards, and as a result, and also because of the history of the tarot, I think we need, through the course of these lessons, to draw more comparisons. So let me tell you which other decks we're going to be using. First and foremost, I have this one, which you'll have already seen in the course introduction. This is a reproduction of the Visconti Sforza tarot. We're using this because this is one of the earliest examples of a complete tarot. In fact, it is one of the earliest tarots that we have. So the symbolism in these cards is already uniquely recognizable, but what we will find as we go through this next number of lessons is the way that the symbols on the Major Arcana of this deck have evolved and grown and accumulated layers of meaning. So we're going to be referring back to this one. This will give us an idea of the roots of these images and how they were originally seen in the 15th century. So along similar lines, I'm also going to be referring to the Marseille pattern of decks. So in this instance, the deck that I've got here is a reproduction of an 18th century French deck. This is the Nicolas Conver tarot as reproduced by Yoav Bendov. I think probably the clearest and most accurate modern representation of this deck. So once again, all of the symbols, the cards in here are uniquely recognizable and very much similar to the Waite-Smith deck, but there are significant differences, and again we'll be referring to those along the way. I'm going to include one more vintage deck, mainly because of a couple of interesting quirks and some very interesting symbolic variations. This is the Swiss 1JJ deck. If you were around in the 70s and 80s, you would probably recognise this deck as a tarot enthusiast. It was one of the key decks, along with the Rider-Waite-Smith, that was instrumental in the modern tarot revival. This is a 19th century Swiss deck based on what's known as a Besançon pattern. And again, that will become apparent as we begin our journey through the cards, but there's some fascinating variations and details in here which I think you'll find interesting. We've already mentioned the Golden Dawn deck, and of course our Waite-Smith tarot with Pamela Coleman Smith's incredible images. One more deck that we're going to be referring to is the classic 1940s Aleister Crowley Thoth tarot painted by Lady Frida Harris. This shares some common roots with Waite and Smith's deck. It's also an offshoot of the Golden Dawn tradition, but Crowley took that tradition in a very different direction. So next to the Waite-Smith deck, this is probably the second most influential modern tarot deck. So again, there are some fascinating variations which shed an interesting light on some of these incredible archetypes and images. So that's the decks we're going to be using. What about the Major Arcana itself? We've just been on a significant journey through 4 suits, 4 elemental suits. Those card images have taken us into places and situations that reflect and resonate very powerfully with our everyday lives. We've also met 16 individual archetypal characters that are powerful reflections of so many different types of human personality. And now we come to these rather enigmatic and powerful 22 supplementary cards that make the tarot so unique. If you've seen tarot in films or on the television, this is what you'll have seen. This is invariably what you'll recognise. So what we have, a sequence of 22 cards, numbered, sometimes with Roman numerals, other times in more modern decks with just our standard Arabic numerals. The numbering matters. In a modern deck, they are numbered from 0 through to 21. And this is something that reflects back to the original game of tarot, which was a trick-taking game. So the trumps, or the triumphs as they would have been known, were numbered in the earlier decks from 1 to 21, and then the card numbered 0 in our modern decks would have been a wild card, which could trump any of the cards whenever it appeared. We'll come to that in a minute. So I think that principle carries over into our modern readings. Rule of thumb for me, look at the number on the card when you pull it. The highest numbered card in a reading of the Major Arcana invariably will be the one that exerts the most power and influence over the reading. So, why these 3 piles? I've got 3 piles of cards and 1 wild card. Incidentally, I've drawn the Major Arcana here from another one of the decks, if you remember, in the course introduction that I recommended as suitable for this course. This is Los Scarabaeo's Universal Tarot. You can see that the images are very similar to the Waite-Smith. In effect, this is a modern reworking of the Waite-Smith deck. I think it was done in the 90s or the late 80s, something like that. It's almost parallel. It has some interesting variations. But as I say, if you have this deck, it's more than suitable to follow this course with. So I thought it would be nice to actually, for a change, to actually follow the Major Arcana just in this lesson with a deck other than the Waite-Smith. So that's what I'll be doing. I've split this down into 3 piles. This is something that I learnt from Rachel Pollack, and very specifically she talks about this in her book 78 Degrees of Wisdom. If you've not come across that, and also if after you finish this course or even during the course you want some powerful in-depth reading, I would thoroughly, wholeheartedly recommend Rachel Pollack's 78 Degrees of Wisdom. It is a real tarot classic. Now, she talks about splitting the Major Arcana down into 3 sections. 3 sections plus the Fool. The Fool, as we see, is the wild card or the 0 card. So, the reason Rachel Pollack favours splitting the majors down into these 3 sections is because she feels that if you lay them out in rows, those 3 groups of cards represent each something very distinct. So let me give you a quick tour through the majors. Obviously, standing separately and slightly apart is the Fool, the archetype of beginnings. Now, moving into the first set of 7, Rachel's view is that these deal with our place in the world. These are powerful archetypes. They are, if we've obviously come to view the court cards as people. We've come to view the numbered pip cards as the places and the environments that those people function in. The Major Arcana stand above that. These are the influences, the timeless principles, the powerful unseen elements that stand above and beyond our experience and actually are more or less out of our control. So Crowley once viewed the tarot as symbolically as a chessboard. Now I would take that analogy and I would view it from this perspective. If you think of the numbered pip cards as the squares on the board, this is not Crowley's view, incidentally. This is kind of Crowley's view that I've taken and adapted myself. Think of the pip cards as the squares on the chessboard. Think of the court cards as the chess pieces. And when you get to the Major Arcana, think of these maybe as however you like to think of them. The big unseen forces, the gods, the great divine players that pick the pieces up and move them across the board. So in real terms, in the Minor Arcana, we're looking at things that are by and large under our control. With the majors, we're looking at things that very often are above and beyond our control and that shape and influence us. So, this first row of majors dealing with our place in the world. Card number 1, the Magician, the ability to transform. Number 2, the High Priestess, the archetype of female or feminine spirituality. How we, in our place in the world, perceive what's above and beyond. The Empress, the archetype of female creativity, the female life force, reproductive capability, fruitfulness. The Emperor, the male creative archetype, the ability to shape, to take raw matter and to give it structure. Masculine rather than male, perhaps, I think. Very much masculine. The Hierophant, the archetype of masculine spirituality, so as opposed to the intuitive perception of the unknown that we see in the High Priestess, here we have the codifying of tradition, the archetypal teacher, perhaps. The Lovers, the archetype of love and of choice. And the Chariot, the archetype of control and mastery. So all of those things, they're powerful archetypes, they are universal truths that are above and beyond us, but they do relate to our place in the world. When we move on to the second group, these relate to a more inward journey. These are inward principles. So, the Strength card, or Fortitude as it's sometimes known, this is not physical strength, this is inner strength, inner resolve, inner endurance, all of those things. The Hermit, the archetype of solitude. The Wheel of Fortune, the archetype of change. Change that's out of our control. The archetype of justice, fairness, rightness. This is the strangest of the images in the Major Arcana, the Hanged Man, this strange young man hung, suspended upside down by his foot, surrounded by a halo. The archetype of inversion and also the archetype of submission to forces greater than ourselves. Things that we can't control. One of the most feared cards in the tarot, and one of the most reviled cards in the tarot. Number 13. This, incidentally, is probably where unlucky 13 comes from. The Death card. Now, let's make a point here. When reading cards, this very rarely, if ever, refers to physical death. And it should never, golden rule number 1, I'm actually probably going to state quite a few more of these golden rules, from time to time as we go through the course. But to me, golden rule number 1, never predict physical death. That's a personal belief of mine. That's between, the time of physical death is between the individual who's dying and whichever divine forces or gods they believe in. It's not our concern. And I think it's one of the most unethical things for people to try and do within a tarot reading, is to predict death. When this appears, this is very much about irreversible change and what we have to let go of. It's the archetype of change. Okay, soapbox over for the time being. And finally, in this second row of cards, Temperance, the archetype of moderation, of blending, of emotional and intuitive balance, the reconciliation of opposites. So as you can see, these are all about our inner life and our inner journey. And this takes us on now to our final sequence of 7 cards. These deal with the above and beyond. So we've gone from our place in the world, our inner reality, and now these are looking at higher reality as we conclude the sequence. So, an interesting start to that sequence, the Devil, card 15. That which, anything that traps us and prevents us from actually reaching our potential or from touching that higher reality, whatever we're bound by, it's the archetype of entrapment. It's the archetype of enslavement. Okay? Yet another of the most feared cards in the deck, and actually unjustifiably so. The Tower, or the lightning-struck Tower, or the House of God. It's the archetype of sudden change. It's the archetype of catastrophe. It can be the archetype of painful sudden change, but actually this is also the archetype of divine intervention. It's the archetype of liberation as well. So, very, very powerful. With that liberation, we can really begin to step into higher realities. One of the loveliest cards in the tarot, and one of the most beloved, the Star. The archetype of hope and of wishes. Beautiful. The Moon. This is the archetype of the unconscious, and the unconscious revealed. So that's a very interesting one. One of the important symbols there is the crayfish in its journey towards the moon and along the path. That is a journey towards higher understanding and higher reality, a journey from the unconscious to the conscious, and then finally to the divine. My favourite card in the whole deck. The card, whenever I'm buying a tarot deck, this is the first card I go to. The Sun. The archetype of joy, warmth, happiness and well-being. Very, very powerful. High up in the ranking numbers, so whenever this appears, it has a supremely powerful influence over any reading that it appears in. Okay? And the final 2 cards. Penultimate card. The Last Judgment. Now, this is the archetype of awakening to responsibility, but also awakening to new life and a higher level of existence. And our final card. The World. The archetype of completion and fulfillment. So there we have 21 cards in 3 distinct sections. So what of that remaining card? The Fool, the Wild card, the Zero card. So in a way, he's separate from and somewhat above and beyond the sequence of numbers. He's the beginning, but then again, is he also the end and the beginning? You know, he can pop up anywhere in this sequence and throw it off course, or indeed throw any of the cards in the tarot off course. So we'll come to him shortly. But there you have it. That is a potted introduction to the most fascinating part of the tarot. Unlike the previous lessons, because of the layers of meaning and the depth of meaning in the Major Arcana, this next series of lessons will deal with fewer cards per lesson, whereas previously I've dealt with 5 numbered pip cards or 4 court cards within an individual lesson. In the coming lessons, we're only going to be dealing with 2 Major Arcana cards at a time. So that means that the Major Arcana will be covered in a series of 11 lessons. Take these at your own pace. Just as I said with the previous Minor Arcana lessons, you know, if you need to break these down and watch them in sections, do. The important thing is that you take them at a pace that you can absorb what is, I think, going to be a considerable amount of information. And this is going to be quite an exploratory journey into the symbolism of these cards. So go at your own speed. It's not a race. But anyway, thank you for joining me. I hope that's been helpful, and I hope that sort of whets your appetite for what's about to come in the coming lessons. I look forward to seeing you next time, and thanks for watching.